So this one is mostly for the parents. If you are a parent of a child who has come to you and said, hey mom, hey dad, I think I'm transgender, and you're just really caught off guard and you don't know what to do about that, this is a video mostly for you. If you are 18 and over and you are questioning, am I transgender or not, this is also a pretty good video for you too. I want to talk today about what makes a person a genuine or real transgender person. Because I think anybody who's being realistic and looking at the current trends is going to notice that there's been a massive upswing in the number of people identifying themselves as transgender. And there has also been a massive upswing in the number of people who are either detransitioning or desisting, which means they no longer identify as transgender. That wasn't always the case. It's a new development. People will quote statistics at you and say, oh yeah, the majority of people who get these surgeries, that, what was it, like 99% or something, are satisfied with their surgeries. Those are old statistics. Things have changed. With the rise in numbers, there has come a similar rise in number of people who detransition, desist, regret their surgeries. Things have changed. And it's important to be aware of that. There are a lot of young people, teenage girls, teenage boys, coming to their parents, and you might be one of those parents, and saying, hey mom, hey dad, I think I'm transgender. And it's not entirely certain if they are transgender, if they aren't transgender. You're hearing about it a lot. It's so heavily saturated in the political discourse that it's really hard to avoid because it's everywhere. It is so pervasive at this point, which means it's really, really easy for your child, your son or your daughter, to be sitting there going, well, maybe I am. The important question to ask at that point is, how do you know? How do you know that you're transgender or not transgender? Because I don't see anyone answering that question. I see a lot of fluffy stuff about that question. I actually made this video a little while ago, and I kind of regret making it now because I've discovered more information, I've learned more, and everything I was talking about where like everybody's uncertain, yes, everybody's uncertain, but that uncertainty should not be as standardized as it is. People should be certain. There should be clear ways to identify whether or not you are transgender. And we don't have that in society. So people are left with these very ambiguous, well, if you feel like you're transgender, then you're transgender. It's like, what does it mean to feel like you're transgender? Like, what is that? So I want to talk about, like, what is a transgender person? Because maybe your kid is transgender, but maybe they're not. And I think any reasonable person looking at this upswing in people who are self-identifying as transgender, they're going to have to ask some questions, like how many of these people only think they are. So this is the part that nobody ever talks about. And it's, I think, in some ways the most important part. Being transgender is a sex-related issue. It has to do with your sexuality. It is not an identity issue. It is a sex-related issue. So all these moms who are saying, oh yes, my 4-year-old is transgender. Number one, the mom doesn't know what she's talking about. Number two, the 4-year-old definitely cannot say for certain whether or not they're transgender because they're 4. They don't have an operating sexuality at the age of 4. Very quickly, that doesn't mean that that child won't eventually grow up to become transgender. Similar to the trope of the gay kid who comes out to their parents only to discover their parents knew or suspected all along, sometimes parents just know. However, parents of gay kids typically don't announce to the world that their 4-year-old is a lesbian. They give the kid time to figure that out themselves. Parents of trans kids would be wise to follow a similar template in most circumstances. Little children do not know what sex is. And so little children cannot say that they are transgender or not. Now, there are cases that I see of little boys and girls who act like the opposite gender, and the parents are sitting there thinking, okay, what is this if it's not transgender? We're going to talk about that. Because those kids, I see those parents being very, very concerned about their children's well-being, because they see a lot of bills that are being labeled as anti-trans, and they're thinking, okay, is my kid going to be safe? Is my kid going to be okay? I'd like to talk about that because it's important for you to know that your child is going to be safe, healthy, and well taken care of. And I think there's fear-mongering right now in the political discourse. I think there's a lot of fear-mongering on both sides, honestly. And so I want to talk about that. But right now, let's talk about being transgender as being an issue with a person's sexuality. And I've said a few times, this is not something that gets talked about. It is a very taboo subject within the trans community. And so I'm very certain that by saying this, a lot of people are going to come forward and say, this is transphobic. It's not. This is just how people are. And I also understand why a lot of people in the trans community don't realize that they fall into the categories I'm about to talk about, because people don't always realize that it's a sex thing. I certainly didn't. So you have two broad categories of true transgender people. The first category is people who are homosexual who don't feel comfortable being homosexual. And I think a lot of the kids that we see who are identifying as trans these days, a lot of the kids who, their parents look at it and say, he dresses in girls' dresses all the time, he doesn't want to be a boy. A lot of those kids ultimately are going to realize that they're just gay. They're either very effeminate gay men or very masculine gay women. And that's okay. You know what? Growing up where I did, there wasn't any stigma attached to being gay. There were some very obnoxious people in the church I attended, and we all just kind of shook our heads and went, what do you guys know? And that was it. And then I moved to the South, and I saw people that I knew getting a lot of grief from their families for being gay. And initially I didn't entirely believe them when they said some of the things that their parents were saying to them. And so one of them showed me a text that her father had sent her, and I was like, oh my God, I can't believe this is still really happening in this country in this day and age. Like, how can people not just, oh, okay, you're gay, all right, cool. That's what I expected. It doesn't always happen like that. And so there are still places in the world, certain church communities, certain families, certain groups of people who tend to be less accepting of homosexuality, even in this day and age. So it still causes problems for people who are gay. I personally think that in the majority of cases, people who are transgender, who are just gay, I think if you give them time, if you give them space, as kids, you have your kid who seems like they're transgender, just give them time and space. They might eventually come out as being gay. That's cool. Just let them grow and let them develop. And I'll talk more about that later. But right now I want to talk about the second group of transgender people. And these are the auto-heterosexuals. I'm an auto-heterosexual, and I think it's pretty obvious. I never transitioned. I never took hormones. I never had the surgeries. I'm married. I have 4 children. I have a very, very normal, boring, but happy life. I think being an auto-heterosexual is something that gets honestly demonized a lot in the trans community. It's typically portrayed very negatively. And honestly, it's not just the trans community. Most of the depictions that I have seen of auto-heterosexuality have been very negative. When I first started to realize that I was auto-heterosexual, my immediate reaction was, oh my God, am I a pervert? Which I'm not, but it can be very unnerving for people when they first realize it. Auto-heterosexuality is, in short, the attraction to oneself as the opposite gender. So being sexually interested in yourself being the opposite gender. And this is where we get a lot of trans ideas, and trans speech kind of revolves around this particularly the idea of gender euphoria. A lot of people talk about gender dysphoria. A lot of the surgeries and procedures and hormones that came about did so because of gender dysphoria. But a lot of people talk about gender euphoria. That's something that's getting talked about more and more. Gender euphoria is an indication, genuine gender euphoria, is an indication of autoheterosexuality. People who are autoheterosexual feel gender euphoria. That doesn't mean that other people don't feel what they would describe as gender euphoria. So in cases where people are getting these plastic surgeries, these, gender affirming surgeries, they're called, double mastectomies, gender affirming hysterectomies, pieces of themselves cut off, and then they feel so great. There are all these videos online of people who are saying they're trans men who are like taking off the bandages and looking at their double mastectomy scars and smiling and laughing and crying. All of that is not necessarily true gender euphoria. Some of it is a person who wanted a plastic surgery and got that plastic surgery and feels happy and is getting that high of, oh my gosh, I had plastic surgery. That's a thing. That's real. That happens. It is not the same as gender euphoria. Gender euphoria is something that a person who is autoheterosexual experiences when they are embodying that cross-gender identity that they so deeply crave. And so a very common example is men who cross-dress. They put on women's clothes and they feel absolutely wonderful. They feel bright, they feel happy, they feel like they're being their true selves. They feel wonderful. This is one example of gender euphoria. And I've seen people who are very much in the TERF, the proud TERF category, saying that this is all just a sex thing, and I don't think they're going about it in quite the right way. They assume that a man who wears a dress and walks into a women's bathroom is somehow getting sexually aroused by it, and that therefore all men who wear dresses or, do any other kind of feminine activity are just getting sexually aroused. And for some people this is the case, but gender euphoria isn't just universally a sexual feeling. My own experiences of gender euphoria have frequently been different. It's a happy, bubbly kind of feeling. And the best way I can describe it is, imagine that you're single and you go out on a first date with somebody. And first dates are always kind of uncertain. You never know quite what you're going to get. But you go out on a first date with somebody and you find them very attractive. And they appear to find you very attractive. And the date goes very, very smoothly and very, very pleasantly. You both have a wonderful time. And the date is drawing to a close. And you make arrangements to see each other again because both of you are looking forward to seeing each other again and having another date like that date because it was wonderful. Everything went perfectly. And you part ways. Either they drive off in their car or you drive off in your car. And as you're leaving the date, you feel happy and bubbly and excited and just, you feel wonderful. And everything is just nice. And you feel good. You're not sexually aroused. You're not horny per se. You're not sitting there going, okay, I need to find a place to be alone so that I can, masturbate to this. You're mostly just really happy, really bubbly, really excited. You just feel good. That's gender euphoria. That's what it feels like. When you're leaving that date and you're feeling happy and bubbly and just everything's really nice and everything's wonderful and cheerful, you don't necessarily sit there and go, oh, this is a sex thing. It is tied into your sexuality, but you're not actively doing anything that you would interpret as being sexual. And in that same kind of abstract way, gender euphoria is tied into an autoheterosexual person's sexuality. But that doesn't mean they feel sexual when doing things that are generating gender euphoria. They're just expressing this one element of their sexuality. I should interrupt myself here to mention that any individual human being's unique sexuality will thread its way through their entire personality. If a person is a tapestry and their sexual nature is one of the threads, you can count on that thread to run through the entire tapestry. I spent way too much of my life trying to hide the parts of myself that I suspected were unusual or abnormal, and some of it was always slipping through, because at the end of the day, this is just who I am. That is what true transgenderism is. Now, there are going to be some people who are gay who feel like they should be the opposite gender, who transition anyway. For whatever reasons, simply being gay just doesn't work for them. But the majority of people in the United States, from the data that we have available, and I would recommend, if you're interested in transgenderism, in these topics, to check out Phil Illy's book, Autoheterosexual. It's an excellent book. It's very well researched, and it's very neutral. He simply states the facts. He states what we know. He goes through historical accounts of transgender individuals. He goes through statistics, and he gives, in a very clear, very understandable way, what we know so far. And so that's very helpful. It's an excellent tool for understanding what transgender people are like. And honestly, I can't push it enough. I think that this is something that the trans community has needed for a long time that has not been available to us. And so instead we have these very vague and not remotely helpful, oh, well, if you just feel like you're transgender, then you are transgender. That doesn't mean anything. There's nothing particularly concrete about any of these fluffy phrases. And so if you are a parent of a person who is identifying as transgender, I'm sorry, I'm sweating like crazy. It's really hot in this car. Oh God, I'm sorry, I'm gross. Anyway, if you are a parent of a child who is coming to you and saying, I think I'm transgender, that's something to be aware of. It's something that you really need to know. Your child might be gay and might be sorting that out, in which case, let them be either as masculine or as effeminate as they want to be, but don't transition them. And when I say don't transition them, don't pick out a new name. Don't pick out new pronouns. It is perfectly healthy and perfectly okay to be a very masculine girl or a very effeminate boy. And let them be those things. And you can talk with them about why they think they're transgender or what makes them think that they're transgender. Those are good conversations to have. But do not start transitioning your child, especially if your child hasn't hit puberty. Because puberty has a way of really sorting a lot of these things out. Like, there are these aha moments that a lot of kids have where it's like, oh, I'm really interested in having sex with other women. Okay, I don't need to be a boy to do that. I can just be a lesbian. That happens a lot. And so give that kid time to grow. But say that that kid is genuinely transgender, genuinely autoheterosexual. Not all autoheterosexuals need surgery. Not all autoheterosexuals need hormones. In fact, I would say that personally, I honestly do not think that those hormones or surgeries are being helpful to young people. And this is why I think that. Autoheterosexuality is a relationship that a young person builds up with their either masculine or feminine alter ego. That's something that they develop within themselves as they grow and as they learn their own sexuality. Every young person has to grow up and learn their own sexuality. Asexual kids have to grow up and learn their own sexuality. Heterosexual, very heteronormative kids have to learn their own sexuality. This is part of the process of growing up. As an autoheterosexual child grows and develops, they're going to develop an understanding of what gives them gender euphoria, what gives them that sense of gender euphoria. And for many of us, it's not nearly so extreme as having parts of our bodies removed. And if you're wondering why I'm putting so much emphasis on gender euphoria instead of gender dysphoria, It's because puberty and the teenage years seem to inevitably contain several phases of discomfort with one's own body and appearance, and I'm not sure how easy it is to differentiate between that and genuine gender dysphoria, i.e., I'm growing hair in places I never wanted to and I just want it to go away. The first thing I told my mother when I developed breasts was, can I have them cut off? I think that's actually a very standard reaction. There are a lot of people out there who are satisfied simply by cross-dressing. And that's okay. And they can live very functional, healthy lives without hormones, surgeries that remove body parts. You can't grow those back. Those surgeries are permanent. When people say that we are limiting access for transgender youth to gender-affirming care, what they're really saying is we're making it so that we can't chop off body parts of children. We can't sterilize children. And I think it's very important that people be made aware of this, because there are a lot of parents of trans children who, or children who appear to be trans, like I'm talking very young children sometimes, prepubescent children, which means they don't know for sure if they're transgender or not, who are worried about their children's health, their mental health, their safety. During puberty, I'm very, very personally, very strongly against puberty blockers. I look at some of the long-term health consequences of puberty blockers, and I don't think there is any reason that a child should be placed on puberty blockers. And there are many other countries that have come to this conclusion as well. That doesn't mean that your child isn't going to get the kind of care that they need. During puberty, a genuinely transgender child needs to learn their own sexuality in the way that any other child developing into adulthood needs to learn their sexuality. This is part of growing up. And children should be allowed to grow up. Growing up for an auto-heterosexual is going to mean figuring out, do I like wearing women's clothes? Do I like cross-dressing? It sounds weird, but that's something that auto-heterosexual people figure out as they grow up. Give a kid time and space to do that. Be very accepting, be very tolerant, but you don't need to transition your child. You don't need to transition your child physically, and you don't need to transition your child socially. That's a very advanced step that most auto-heterosexuals don't actually get to. There are many, many people in this world who are auto-heterosexual who never transitioned. I'm one of them. We don't all need the surgeries, the hormones, the puberty blockers. We do not all need that. We need to figure out ourselves, as all human beings who are growing into adulthood need to do. We need to figure out what gives us a sense of gender euphoria, what feeds our soul. I hate to be all poetic about it, but seriously, what feeds your soul? What makes you happy? What makes you feel fulfilled? What makes you feel content? What gives you a sense of gender euphoria? And for the love of God, get your children away from the internet. You don't want them being fed ideas by other people about what it is to be transgender, what gender euphoria should look like, any of that crap. If your child comes to you and says, I think I'm transgender, tell them that's great. Tell them that's fine. Tell them that this is an excellent opportunity for them to sit down somewhere away from the internet and away from their friends at school and away from outside influences and figure out what that means for them and how that's going to be expressed in their life. Surgeries, hormones, medical interventions are things that happen at the most advanced stages of auto-heterosexuality. These are decisions that adults make. And the adults who make them are adults who have had plenty of time to explore their own sexuality. Your 13-year-old has not had the time to do that. Your 13-year-old, honestly, probably has no idea what they're talking about. That doesn't mean they're not transgender. It doesn't mean that they are not autoheterosexual. But if they're just starting to discover this part of themselves, they need time to make that journey. And as an autoheterosexual myself, who has made that journey, I'm 36 now, I think it's very important that people like me come forward and say this. Children should not be transitioned. It is not healthy for them. It is not healthy for their development. Because at the end of the day, transgenderism is about a person's sexuality. And that's something we all need to recognize. As a final note, if you are a parent of a child who is coming to you and saying that they think they're transgender and you are alarmed and you're concerned and you don't know what to make of what's going on, Our Duty is a really good organization. I highly recommend them. They operate on the assumption that your child is not transgender, but I think it's very important to note that even if your child is transgender, as long as you are open and accepting of the person that they are, they're going to be okay. Like, this isn't some program that's like, okay, we need to do conversion therapy on your kid, because we all know, anybody who knows anything about conversion therapy knows it is only going to be successful at burying a person's sexuality. The sexuality is still there. And burying a person's sexuality is not healthy. So, we don't want to do that. But taking them away from outside influences, realizing and being very honest about the negative impact that hormones, puberty blockers, surgeries can have on a young person, this is important information. And maybe your child ultimately will decide that they are transgender. That is fine. Your job as their parent is to ensure that they have the time and the space to develop that part of their sexuality in a way that is healthy and is not going to have long-term negative consequences for them. I hope this helps you, and I wish you all the very best of luck.